Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines in History with me, your host, Jon Molik. Now, here's what we're going to do to start off a brand new series. We just completed the series on Israel and Palestine with a bunch of the history, and then we had some response episodes based on comments that were made, questions that were posed online. And I said that we were going to get into other aspects of all of the things that fall under the Headlines in History umbrella. And while I was thinking about what that might be and what we should start potentially focusing on outside of the Israel and Palestine issue, whether that be Ukraine or whether it be China, Taiwan, something more into Europe or either South America, I recognize that we have, or those that are in my world, those that are in my community, are getting ready for another deployment, and it just so happens to be back to the Middle East. And they are falling under something called Operation Spartan Shield. And that is a very important mission, particularly for the National Guard. Spartan Shield being the joint term, and Task Force Spartan being the Army component of that. But it's a mainly Middle East-focused mission where the United States spends time with allies, reassuring allies, and conducting military engagements and these other things. We train together, all this stuff. Generally speaking, for the National Guard, these National Guard divisions that we have throughout the Army, they rotate through this mission because it's an enduring mission, and it's a really important mission underneath what's the general CENTCOM, Central Command area of operations. And so there's another rotation coming for the unit that happens to be in New York, the 42nd ID, famous Rainbow Division, and they're going to be heading out the door in within the next year. And so I thought, as I was part of this mission last time, I spent a good amount of time writing a bunch of mini papers as the one of the senior intel analysts for the division, trying to prep both the senior staff and the soldiers on foundational understandings of the region that soldiers who had not deployed there before could use as stepping stones. Right? You could read lots of books, obviously, and you could watch movies, and you could look at documentaries on YouTube and all these different things. But you could also have a concise, clear focus, and we did that as part of the leadership in the unit. And I helped drive the charge, lead the charge on that, if you will. And so I've decided I think it'll be great for the soldiers. And again, this is the main priority I have for this podcast. I know that others that are not soldiers listen, but particularly this is the main focus of the podcast here, is to educate soldiers and prepare them for missions that they will be involved in throughout their career. And I said, well, why don't we just do a podcast in terms of preparation for the deployment as opposed to writing these papers? And particularly, we could even expose other units to this medium as they prepare for their missions in support of Operation Spartan Shield as well. We did certainly pass on some of the work that we had done in years past to other units, but it's a little easier if you could just get this on a cell phone or plug it into a website and jump on one of the podcast sites out there and just kind of listen as you're driving to work. It's a little easier maybe than reading a PDF that's multiple pages long, covering a particular topic. So that's what we're going to do here now over the next X amount of weeks. I don't know exactly how long it's going to take. I don't know exactly how many topics we're going to cover. But I want to certainly build a foundation, a historical foundation, and relate that to what's happening in today's world. That's particularly important here on Headlines in History. What the history is of the region. What are some of the big events that have occurred either in a specific country itself? Like, let's say we're going to do an episode on Jordan, for example, and we'll talk about what's specific to that country and why it matters. Again, matters to those that are within the Central Command area of responsibility. And then also some of the bigger questions like, okay, we're going to the Middle East. Well, what is that, and what does that mean for me? Now, for those that are not part of the military community here that are listening because they just kind of happen to enjoy headlines in history, thanks again for joining us. But let me make something really clear here. I'm not producing this podcast for the military that's preparing to go down range because they have no idea what they're doing. Right? So don't jump to that conclusion. That is certainly not the case. The United States military, the United States Army, the National Guard, we have been operating within the Middle East, in particular in large numbers, let's say since the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam in 1990 and then 91. So we've been there, we've been there rotationally for a very long time. And so the institutional knowledge of the Middle East between the services as well as the intelligence community as a whole is very strong. And yes, there's not going to be anybody that works in the CIA or the greater DIA or whatever that are going to be listening to this little podcast about what the history of the Middle East is. That's not the case. However, we do have young soldiers. We have soldiers that have just joined the Army that have been in for 2 or 3 years, or we have young lieutenants that have just joined the Army who have been in for 2 or 3 years. Maybe they haven't deployed before. Maybe they haven't spent any time in the Middle East. Maybe their college focus wasn't the Middle East. Maybe it was on the Indo-Pacific, for example, or maybe they were business majors and they don't really have a very strong historical background on the area they're going. And so it's incumbent upon them to prepare. It's incumbent upon the Unit 1 to prepare them as best they can, but particularly for National Guard soldiers who spend most of their time in the civilian world doing whatever it is they do as a civilian. Then they come to drill 1 weekend a month and they're like, okay, great, now I'm getting ready to deploy and I'm going to spend the next 9 months or whatever the timeline is in the Middle East. I better start studying. I better get spun up on what's been happening there over the last 2,000 years maybe, or even before then, and come to understand what are all the intricacies and important parts and important storytelling and all those things that relate to this mission. So, so don't fret for those that are not part of the military wondering, boy, oh boy, if it really is the responsibility of this little podcast here to ensure the Army knows what it's doing. That certainly is not the case. Okay, it's mainly for those that are taking their first step, if you will, and are looking to get themselves spun up, just like it was for me when I first joined the Army at 17. And if you were to ask me where Oman was, I probably would have struggled a little bit. I wouldn't have been able to tell you the difference between Oman and Yemen, although the difference between those two countries on the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula is very important. And so I went off and did my studying, and we're just offering a different way for the soldiers to prepare for this. So I think it's a good idea. I've talked to some peers. They think it's a good idea. And so we're going to dive right in. All right. Enough explanation on that. But one more thing I will say is that for those of you that have your experience in the Middle East in particular, then this series may not be for you on the whole. And what I mean by that is we're going to start off here with what I'm going to call Chapter 1 in this study guide series, which is just the Middle East in general. We're going to get much more specific and get into countries and groups and personalities and events and all these things. But we're going to start big picture and just talk about geography and the physical nature of the Middle East and why it isn't even important in the first place. And so if you've been there and you've read a bunch of books on the Middle East and you've deployed there many times and you get it, well, then maybe this episode isn't for you. Maybe the whole history of the Middle East discussion isn't for you. You've been there and you've done that. So maybe you'll skip ahead to a couple episodes when we get there. Again, as we discuss maybe the history of Iraq, and maybe you never went there. You deployed to Afghanistan, or you haven't really studied Iraq, so you don't really recall what some of the most important parts of that city are. Like, what really is Baghdad, and what in terms of a historical sense, and why does it play such a role, and why is one of the provinces called Salah ad-Din in Iraq? Is that like another place? Is that a name for a person? And maybe you just don't know. So that's an episode for you to pay attention to. So if you've been there and you've done that, this might be a little juvenile in a sense, or maybe it's a nice refresher. I don't know, but it's certainly not going to be a discussion that is at the scholarly level. We're not going to spend 10 episodes on the history of Mesopotamia and get down to the nitty-gritty of every single ruler that was ever there. That's not the place we need to be in terms of a mindset for the deployment. And as I've said 1,000 different times on this show here, I'm not a scholar, and I'm not an official historian in any way. So, and I'm not going to claim to be. I'm just going to go over generalized understandings that the soldiers, young lieutenants, young captains, those that haven't been there should probably understand. And to me, it's an easier medium than going through a bunch of 5 to 10 page papers on the historical aspects of some of this area. So that's what we're going to do. So welcome to the study guide series for Operation Spartan Shield, Chapter 1, and we're going to call it the Middle East. Quick caveat, again, I do not speak for the United States Army. I don't speak for the government. I don't speak for anybody else but myself. I don't think we're going to get too much into these series in anything too potentially political or opinionated. We're going to do a lot of factual type stuff, although we know history has a lot of nuance in there as well. But nonetheless, just to cover our bases, just remember this is all just me speaking off the cuff and doing some work here for those that will be embarking on a new mission in their military career. How are we going to do it? How are we going to break this down in order to make it somewhat organized? And so what I think we'll do is we're going to go in a question and answer format, particularly when it comes to the countries. And that's one of the things I want to do. I want to talk about the greater Middle East to start this thing off. And then we're going to get into specific countries that I believe are relevant for the mission. I know are relevant for the mission, let's say. And then we'll probably talk about some other topics that deserve their own time. Maybe we'll talk about the history of Islam, for example, and how that affected the region in particular, and how that started in Saudi Arabia, now called Saudi Arabia, but the Arabian Peninsula, and then spread throughout. And then what the difference is between Southwest Asia, for example, and the Middle East, and how terrain plays a role in that, and how the cultures are different, why Iran became Persian, but yet the West stayed Arab, those type of things. And so, but we'll do it in a question and answer format. So here's what I came up with. We've got 10 questions, and they'll be the same when we're talking about countries. We'll start with number 1. Where are we talking about? That seems pretty basic, right? Number 2, why are we talking about it? Why is it even important? Aside from the fact that it's just part of the mission. 3, we're going to go into what is the history. Where did it start? Why is there even a story to be told about the country that we're talking about? Then we'll get into climate and geography, the physical aspects, the terrain, if you will, of that region. 5, who lives there? Clearly, that's important. The people that live there at one point and then live there today. 6, what are the general political and legal systems? That's also something that should be covered, I think. 7, what's the country's military capabilities? That's also very important. This is we're talking about the whole purpose of this mission is a military one at the end of the day, although not kinetic. Number 8, what are the general social aspects, right? Religion, art, entertainment. What are those standards? What does that framework look like? That has a great effect on what a country is. And then what are the country's economic strength and weaknesses? The economy plays a huge role into number 9. And then 10, we'll shift into the future. Where do we see this country in the next 5 to 10 years? So we'll do a little bit of a geopolitical analysis, a little bit a look into the foreign affairs and geopolitical status of the country, and then maybe where they're going to be, again, in the next 5 to 10 years in a lot of different aspects, maybe their economy, their military, their relationships with the United States, that kind of thing. Now, these 10 questions can't fall in perfectly with all of the topics we're going to cover. So the way I describe those 10 questions won't work specifically for the Middle East. It won't fit well. And if I'm going to talk about a certain person or an aspect like Islam, for example, that won't make any sense. But we're going to try to stick to the standard questions the best way that we can. It may not be perfect, but we're going to try to stick to that organization so the episodes going forward can have some type of repetitive nature to them, and we can ensure that if I'm talking about Iraq, for example, as opposed to Jordan, we can make sure that we're covering the same bases and we don't miss out on certain things in certain countries because we don't have somewhat of a standard. All right, so we're going to use that kind of question and answer format going forward. The other thing I want to make sure you know is what sources I've used. There's a whole bunch of them out there, and yes, I've spent time reading articles, and even there's some really good YouTube stuff out there with universities, for example, that you can trust for good scholarship. YouTube's just a great medium nowadays. I mean, Of course, there's a bunch of silliness on YouTube as well, but there are some really serious historians and again, universities that are out there. But from a written perspective, and there's a whole host of them, it's not, we'll be here all day if I give a list of all of those. But I did focus on a few books that I had read throughout my time studying this region. And I did rely on them so heavily that I thought it a good idea to make sure that I mention them, and I'll put links to them in the notes. But the first two are from an author I just absolutely love when it comes to the Middle East, and that's Bernard Lewis, who's an old, and I say that literally, he's an old gentleman who wrote some great books, very prolific. And a few of them are very popular, a little bit controversial in some ways, but some also very standard. And one is called What Went Wrong? The Clash Between Islam and Modernity in the Middle East. And that's a shorter work, and it's a bit controversial because the title in and of itself, What Went Wrong, implies that there was a problem, but there's so much historical context in there. It makes sense when we start to get into the modern Middle East discussions about what the Middle East is, say, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You get a lot from that. Then I have a second book, The Middle East, A Brief History of the Last 2,000 Years, which is also a very good book by Lewis, but this is more about just describing the history per se and not necessarily getting into a lot of theses as to why things are the way that they are. It's foundational. It's really big, and a lot of the history I draw from that. Then we have Scott Anderson's Lawrence in Arabia, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Great book. You can learn a lot about, again, modern Middle East standards, why things are the way that they are through what happened in World War I and Lawrence of Arabia, who just happens to be one of my favorite historical figures. So that's a great book. And then again, World War I, David Fromkin, he wrote a book called A Peace to End All Peace, The Fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Creation of the Modern Middle East. You can learn so much about the modern Middle East through what happened pre and post World War I. And then finally, God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire, and the Making of the Modern World. This was written by Alan McHale. And so I'll link all of these books down in the show notes, and so you'll have access to them to be able to reference them. I'm not gonna be referencing all of the books when I'm going through and having these discussions. Just understand these are the ones that I used most of the time, specifically when we're going through and discussing the history of different things, but not exclusively. There are other things, other resources that I've used to have all these discussions. Okay, that's a long introduction on not only the series, but the episode here today. So now that we're through it, I've set the foundation. You know what we're going to do, so let's get into it. Operation Spartan Shield, Chapter 1 of the study guide. What is the Middle East? Why is it called that? What does it look like? If you've never been there, what does it feel like? And what is it at all that we're really even talking about? And the best way to start to visualize, and this is one of the challenges of doing this in a podcast format, obviously, is I can't show you a map. But you could look at one yourself, and I would suggest you do just that as I'm beginning the conversation now. If you have the opportunity, if you're not listening in the car, go ahead and take a look at a map, and I'll explain visually, as best as I can. I'm going to explain through a visual understanding of the map what it is, what the Middle East is. You've heard it all before, the famous axiom that history is written by those that win wars. And it is true in a lot of ways. And it is certainly true when it comes to the Middle East. Because you look at the title in and of itself and you say middle. Well, middle of what? The middle of where? And if it's the middle of something, it has to be in comparison to something else. And that's exactly what happened. So a lot of our understanding, particularly in the West, of what the Middle East is, comes from those that have been victorious throughout X amount of last centuries. And that happens to be the Europeans in a lot of ways. And particularly when you get into the 19th and then 20th centuries, World War I and World War II. And so when the British as the lead, but the French are there as well. We'll talk in future episodes about Napoleon going down into Egypt, but just generally Western European, factually, have been winning wars over the last couple of centuries. And so they have found the ability, in fact, given themselves their own authority, to label the rest of the world. And so what they did in this region, they initially called it the Near East, because again, if you look at it on a map, if Europe is to the left or the west as you're staring at a map that looks flat, then everything to the east, to the right, would be east, obviously. So you have what would be then the Near East and the Far East. The Far East would be like the Indo-Pacific region, India on further into Japan and China and Mongolia, all the way to the what was then called the Far East. So what would be the Near East? Well, the Near East would be what was closer, clearly. It was initially called the Near East, but eventually the British started using the term, again, late 19th century into the 20th century, the Middle East, because they wanted to specifically draw the difference between what was closer to them geographically, which would be like Turkey and Greece, which is further west and closer to Western Europe, and then the Arabian desert lands of the Eastern Sahara, if you're talking about Northeast Africa, and then the desert areas of, again, Arabia and Iraq and the Persian Gulf, and then closer to Iran. And then the differences between that and that would be over the Iranian plateau, further east, again, and now you're talking, you're getting into the Stans and the Slavs and the Russians and the Chinese. And so the British started calling it the Middle East. And they're saying it's in the middle between the near and the far. And so here we go. Now, again, middle because of those who have won. Now, if you're clearly living in Iran, it makes no sense to you to call the Middle East because the world is focused on you and the center of the universe is you. And so it's therefore the middle of nothing. But nonetheless, Middle East for those that have been victorious in the most recent wars of the last couple of centuries. And if you're to look at it, the Middle East from the center, if I were to put a pin in the middle of it, you could likely draw a point probably in the middle of what is today's Iraq, right between the two rivers that are most important to the history of the Middle East, the Tigris and the Euphrates, two very, very important rivers that run from the northwest in Turkey, from the Caucasus, particularly from the north and then the northwest in Turkey, and then down southeast towards the Persian Gulf. And they cut right along through what was at one point called Mesopotamia. And we'll talk about that when it comes to the history. And the reason that I point them out is because as the center is because that's really where the start of civilization began here in the Middle East. Now, other civilizations coalesced and they were hunter-gatherer societies all over the world, and then they eventually found themselves into small city-states, and they started creating writing and the wheel and different things, and it happened in different parts of the world. We'll talk about them, but for one of the earliest and most well-known would be the Middle East in Mesopotamia, and it was around these two rivers. What had happened was people that were warring tribes and were running around the plains in the north in Turkey, and then the Caucasus, who had come down from the Black and the Caspian Sea, rather, had eventually made their way down into Mesopotamia, and then they settled around the rivers for obvious reasons. You need water in order to live, so that's where they stopped. Now, so geographically, it wouldn't be the center. The points between the two rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates, wouldn't technically be the center in terms of mileage. If you were to do the difference, if you were to calculate the difference between the center of the two rivers in, say, the middle of Iraq in and around Baghdad, and then went directly south all the way through the Arabian Peninsula down into the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which is on the southern tip of that peninsula, that is much further in distance than, say, the distance between Baghdad and going northwest to the Black Sea or going northeast to the Caspian Sea. So it's not center geographically, but it's in terms of distance, but it's center in terms of history and time, because we're gonna start here and then we're gonna kind of expand out both west and east and south as we draw the story as we go through the timeline of how this thing called civilization, again, at least in this part of the world, began and then spread its way out. Okay, so we'll start here in the center, and I'm going to go around here like kind of like clockwise to try and give you a full 360 understanding of what it is that we're looking here at the map. So from the center, as I said to you, looking at your map, you've seen the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the center there is what today's Iraq is. Down to the bottom left, you have the massive Sahara Desert. This is, from a global perspective, the northeast portion of Africa, which is it is some of the most inhospitable areas to live in the entire world. The center of the Sahara. Now you have the Nile Delta, which flows south out of the Mediterranean down the Nile River along the east coast of Africa, and it kind of runs parallel in a lot of ways to the Red Sea, which is the split between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. But nonetheless, without the Nile, you have just inhospitable desert. Okay, so you have the Sahara on the bottom left of your map, and as I had said, you have the Mediterranean Sea just to the north. So if you're looking at a physical map, you'll see that everything is just tan, except for some light brown areas, and you might even get a little green up near the Nile Delta, which sits just on the top of Africa along the Mediterranean Sea. All right, something closer to what's called the Libyan Plateau, way up in the north. But anyways, you hit the Mediterranean Sea, and then on the opposite end of the Mediterranean Sea, so the north of that, would be where you begin to get into Europe. And you'll see the islands that surround Greece, and you'll see Crete, and you'll see the Aegean Sea, Mount Olympus. And if you continued up northwest, you'd get yourself into Europe. And it's very green, and it's very lush up there. Now you're getting into forest lands, woodlands, the complete opposite of what you see in the Sahara Desert on the bottom end of the Mediterranean Sea. So temperatures are similar. It's gonna be hot and dry and nasty in the center of the Sahara, but when you get up on the Mediterranean coastline, there isn't a lot of difference between how you feel the temperature and you feel the humidity of the North African coastline on the Sahara than you would in the southern portion of Turkey, say, for example, that's riding along the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? So the Mediterranean Sea up to Greece and Turkey. Now you're going to turn right a little bit. If you go too far north, towards the Black Sea and north, you're going to get into Europe. So we're going to stay out of there. Turn right into what is called Anatolia. It's today's Turkey. And now you'll be heading, if you continue to head east, you'll be looking into what's called the Caucasus. And there's a mountain range called the Caucasus Mountains. There's the Lesser Caucasus and Greater Caucasus that sit in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And so Sahara north to Mediterranean, now you've got Greece and Turkey. Just north of Turkey is the Black Sea. And what I said was we're not going to continue to go that way because we'll get into Europe. So we switch east, and then we hit the land again, which is called the Caucasus, and then water again, which is called the Caspian Sea. This is still all greenish. Even when you get into the highlands on the upper mountains, you see snow, very wet. The Pontic Mountains are here. Again, the Caucasus Mountains are here. Livable woodland, not dry. Then as you make your way to the Caspian Sea, on the east side, you get back into what is more desert-like. And we can't go too far east because we'll get into the Far East. So you're coming to the Caspian Sea, you look east, it's desert-like. Now you have to come back down and look south. We're getting to the 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock area on our clock. And this is where we fall into the Iranian Plateau. This is where we find ourselves in the Persian areas of the Middle East, and we'll talk about that as the history comes about. And then down towards the Zagros Mountains, which run parallel to the Persian Gulf. All right, and we'll talk about how the separation between the mountains there created the differences between the Persian and the Arab peoples. And then down to the Persian Gulf, you'll see that there's the Gulf of Oman, which flows to the southeast down into the Arabian Sea. And then in the center, we're looking directly at Saudi Arabia, which is physically called the Arabian Peninsula. Now we're at the 6 o'clock, if you will, from the center all the way down to the 6, down to the Gulf of Aden, To the west, the Red Sea, and then back to the Sahara. So it's the northeast of Africa and the Sahara. We go up to the Mediterranean. We find ourselves in Greece and Turkey. We take a right. Now we're at about 11 o'clock. We find the Black Sea over to the Caucasus, into the Caspian. We're now at like 1 o'clock. We turn south. We're now coming down the Iranian Plateau. We find ourselves in the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, and then down into the Arabian Sea. We look left, and we're smack dab in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula. Called a peninsula for obvious reasons, because on the west side of the Arabian Peninsula is the Red Sea, which separates the Arabian Peninsula and the Sahara. And then on the east side, the right side, is the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, which separates the Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian Plateau. All right, so it sticks out like a peninsula in the same way that Florida, for example, kind of sticks out, although their shapes are very different. Both peninsulas none the same, or nonetheless, okay? And the way that the terrain breaks down here, there are three very significant, one being the most significant, passageways that connects Europe up in the northwest down to the Middle East and into the Arabian Sea, and then which would allow you to head off to the Far East, that we have in most important passageways in almost all of the world. You can make the claim that the Panama Canal, a man-made canal in the West, is really, really important. But the connection between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, which splits right along the separation between what we have called the Eastern Desert here in Africa, and then the Arabian Peninsula along the Sinai Peninsula, which is a whole nother small peninsula here, is something called the Suez Canal. And it's a very, very small, very, very thin, comparatively, waterway that allows shipping to traverse the Mediterranean Sea down into the Red Sea and into the Arabian Sea without having to go around the entirety of Africa. And it cuts down time significantly. And today, it's currently owned by Egypt. And there was fighting over the Suez in the 20th century. But nonetheless, it's owned by Egypt today. It's controlled by Egypt. But quite literally, the vast majority of goods that are shipped between the Far East and Europe come right through the Suez Canal. So after you make it through the Suez Canal, say you're traveling from the Mediterranean down southeast, you make it through the Suez, and you're now in the Red Sea. You're traveling south. On the left, if you're facing south, would be the Arabian Peninsula. On the right is the Sahara, is Africa. And you make it all the way down until it gets to another little point where you open up into the Gulf of Aden. That is called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And it is, again, a short and narrow waterway that the Red Sea opens up into the Gulf of Aden. And then if you're allowed to go, or if you follow the Arabian Sea up northwest, say you're traveling up and then you go north again to the Gulf of Oman, and you want to make it all the way up into the Tigris and Euphrates, you'll follow what's called the Persian Gulf, all the way up to the mouth of both the Tigris and Euphrates that flow into the Gulf, into what the country is called Kuwait today. And then you could travel and send goods up the Tigris and the Euphrates up into the Caucasus. So why are these all important? Because clearly, if you were to break the connection, if you were to block the Suez Canal, if you were to block the Bab el-Mandeb Strait down in the Gulf of Aden, and if you were to block the Gulf of Oman from the Persian Gulf at the bottom, the southern eastmost portion of the Arabian Peninsula, as it flows, as it sits below the Iran and the Iranian Plateau, then you can control a significant amount of trade in between Europe and the rest of the world, at least into the Far East. And so these waterways, these particular passages are instrumental to global trade. And so we've had a conversation in the past on the show about the realities of geopolitics. And sometimes we may not think that the decisions that are made by power players are all that moral or ethical. But sometimes it's just big boy geopolitics. And so certain parts of the world are important just because of the way that they're designed. And that is no doubt true when it comes to the Middle East. I mean, the first part of the conversation would be oil, the natural resources that are found, the vast oil fields that are found underneath Iran and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and all of these other locations, Iraq, and others, where the 20th century was basically built upon the backs of combustion engines that run on this fossil fuel, and there's so much of it in the Middle East. And then you have the ability to traverse, send goods and services even, from Europe down into the Far East, right through the heart of the Middle East, in between Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. And whoever controls that, to include the liquid gold, the brown, black gold that's found underneath the sand, then you have a real authority, a real power, a real grasp of what's happening in the rest of the world if you control those things. And Europe has spent a long time in the last couple of centuries trying to get their hands on those locations or making friends with people who do live there because of how important it is, again, to global trade. It may not be fair, right? If you're to give a comparison to how important the Suez Canal is, right, to say to some river in the middle of a landlocked country in Africa, if no resource has been found there that's of any relevance or major importance to the rest of the world, then just from a prioritization standpoint, the central country, landlocked country, call it, Chad or whatever in the center of Africa, just isn't as important. That's sad in the sense that Chad isn't going to get money and resources and protection and support from outside countries who are looking to protect that resource or at least extract that resource in some way. But it is just the reality. So the reality is, based on what actually exists within the Middle East, is what has made the Middle East so important to the global players that have existed, that have been in charge, if you will, over the last couple of centuries, through nobody's fault in and of themselves. It just is what it is. But it's the main reason why the Middle East has become such a topic, and there has been so much going on, so much focus on the Middle East because of these resources. Now, there's going to be other stories we're going to come across. Again, the civilization starting in the Middle East, at least one of the first human civilizations, and then we're going to have the home of the Abrahamic, or the three largest and three arguably most important religions in all of the world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Again, from a monotheistic standpoint, obviously there are other religions like Hindu and Buddhism and others that are very popular, very important, but not monotheistic in the same way that the Abrahamic religions are. And so all of these things combined make the Middle East, quote unquote, important. Okay, so that's what the Middle East from a physical perspective looks like. I can do it no justice by just having this conversation. You have to get out a map, specifically a terrain map, and you have to look, and you'll see exactly what it is that I'm talking about in terms of where the deserts are, where the water is, where it gets green, where the mountains are. And we'll go through the series here and discuss why certain things have happened, why people's ended up where they ended up. And again, throughout history, most of the time, 99% of the time, it's because of the terrain. It's because that's where the resources are. That's where it's easiest to live in terms of temperature and food and water and all those other things. And that's why we like to say, never trust straight lines on a map, because if there are straight lines on a map, that means that a human drew it and that it wasn't a natural barrier between peoples created by the actual geography on the ground. Like, as I'll continuously say, the Persians in the east and the Arabs in the west, because they're separated by the Zagros Mountains. When you have the straight line that separates Syria and Iraq, drawn by the British and the French at the end of World War I, you're going to have some issues. But what I'll tell you is that even though Iran and Iraq have gone to war before, and we'll get into the later discussions of that, but that was a man-made construct. That was, Saddam didn't like the Persians, and the Persians didn't like the Arabs, so they ended up, and those in power in Iran at the time, they didn't like Saddam, so they ended up going to war against each other. But generally speaking, throughout the millennia, the Arabs didn't really have, eventually when they made their way out of the Arabian desert into the Middle East, there wasn't really that much of an issue between the Arabs and the Persians in any real sense, because it's like, well, I don't live over there and they don't live over here, and so we'll just kind of do our own thing. And you'll find spotted history where that kind of clashes, but generally speaking, it works out because there's a huge mountain range that separates everybody, and not the big of a deal. Everybody kind of accepts that reality. Okay, that's the terrain. Let's talk about specifically the countries. So we have, as we've talked about on the show, right, we have nationalism that pops up after the empire's fall in World War I, and so we have a growth of nations where we specifically say, this is my land, this is my line, and I live here and you live there, and then we're going to fight over if we have to. Okay, so talked about Middle East, coined by the English in late 19th, early 20th centuries, and technically mostly accepted by most people is that the Middle East as a whole encompasses the Arabian Peninsula, which I have said a couple of different times, the Levant, Turkey, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq. Okay, those are the generally accepted regions, mini regions, if you will, mini areas that fall under the greater Middle East. So the Arabian Peninsula, what's there? There's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Yemen. Okay, so look at a map and you'll see where those specific countries are, but that's considered the Arabian Peninsula. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi, the UAE, and Yemen. And then up to the west, you have the Levant. Generally accepted is Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and then the Palestinian territories, however you accept that. Whether you do or whether you don't, that's just kind of what it's called. So the Arabian Peninsula, Levant, then you have Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Egypt. Right? Those don't really fall under either one of those titles. They're not on the peninsula, but they're also not in the Levant, which is closer to the Mediterranean. So they're their own little countries, and they're accepted as part of the Middle East, if you will, and not the Far East. Generally speaking, ethnically, Arabs constitute the vast majority of people who live in the region. Those that have come out of the Arabian Peninsula, the Arabian Desert, with the flow of Islam after Muhammad's death in 632, the Arabs ended up conquering and populating much of the Middle East before they were again stopped by the Persians and then Europeans further west. And that remains the case today. So Arabs are the major ethnic group throughout all of the Middle East. But then there are others. They're not the only ones, but there are others. The Turks, the Persians, as I've mentioned, the Kurds, the largest ethnic group in the world without a country. We have the Azeris and the Copts, which are down from Egypt. The Azeris aren't. Let me say that differently. So the Azeris up near the Caucasus from Azerbaijan area, and then the Copts, which are from down southwest in the Africa and Egypt areas. We have the Jews, obviously, the Assyrians, which are from northern Iraq area. We have the Iraqi Turkmen, which are a little different. They are different from the Turks who come from Turkey or Anatolia. So it gets a little confusing. I remember learning this when I was in Iraq in 2005, and I'm like, so wait a minute, the Iraqi Turkmen, so there's Turkmen in northern Iraq. Well, those are clearly just the Turks from Anatolia, and it's not the case. They are different people. The Yazidis, who are often, they're small and are often, unfortunately, the target of much hate and the target of many others. And then you have the Greek Cypriots, which we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about the Sea peoples and those coming from Europe into the Middle East. So that's the broader discussion. We have the Middle East, why it's called what it's called, what it looks like from a physical terrain perspective, what the countries are, and a little bit about why it matters. The Suez Canal, the peninsula itself, the trade between Europe and the Far East, and then clearly we don't have to beat a dead horse, but it's the black gold that exists underneath the sands in the Middle East. It became to be such a resource for all of the 20th century. On the next episode, we're going to get into the history. We're going to talk about the first peoples to actually coalesce in and around the Tigris and Euphrates River Basin area as it flows into the Persian Gulf, often considered the cradle of civilization, and what that looked like from the very beginning. And then we'll have some comparisons to other places in the world. So that's it. That's what the Middle East looks like. That's the broad perspective. Next episode, join me, episode 49. We're going to start getting into the history of Middle East and the peoples that are there. Thanks for joining me here today as we start our study guide series on Operation Spartan Shield. This is Chapter 1. feel free to head off to headlinesandhistory.com. Follow me on social, Blue Sky, Twitter, X, whatever you call it nowadays, and my own website. That you'll have all of the episodes there. And if you feel free to contact me and ask any questions or point anything out, if you will. But thanks for joining me here again today, and we'll see you next episode.